John Hively here again. Today I'm continuing with the series on the rise of the United States oligarchy. You know, the guys who control both major political parties, the Supreme Court, both houses of Congress, the presidency, those guys. Anyway, so to understand this history, well, you need to go back to FDR and the United States Supreme Court and his battle with it. On the court were several people, justices, who sided with the oligarchs. FDR, as I covered last time, in the last episode, vanquished them. So democracy was alive and well. And World War II came and went. President Truman came and went. And then President Eisenhower came. Now, Eisenhower is an interesting case study in that, what's the difference between then and now? How did democracy work then compared to how it doesn't work now? Well, right now you have a Social Security system that is under stress, that's under siege. And back then, what did Eisenhower campaign on? Television advertisements actually said that show Eisenhower saying that he's going to strengthen Social Security. And in 1953, as president, he did. No one's talking about strengthening Social Security nowadays, even though it's supposedly the trust fund is going to run out of money within, say, 12 years. So anyway, you go through the history of the 1940s, the 50s, and the 60s, and I'm going to touch on some events. And what you find is that as democracy worked, as people demanded such things as their civil rights, well, those things cut into the income of the wealthy, of the top 1%. By the way, all of the figures I'm going to show you during this program are going to be from the World Inequality Database, which you can access online. Anybody can. So anyway, recollect that the top 1% rely on the stock markets for 69 to 100% of their total income. So in 1929, at the beginning of the Great Depression, the wealthy managed to use government, because they controlled it, to reap 36% of the total income produced in the United States, which meant that the rest of us got to split 64%. So think of it in those terms. So this is my admittedly low-tech graph. And it's not much of a graph. Today I think I'm going to call this show Democracy and the Financial Markets, 1941 to 1970. So, as I said, the wealthy in 1929 received 36%, or stole 36% of the total income and wealth in the United States because they were an oligarchy and there was no democracy. By 1941, after the establishment of democracy in the United States, they received 21%, which meant the bottom 99% went from splitting 64% of the total income produced in the United States among ourselves to 79%. So Eisenhower becomes president. He strengthens Social Security. 1954, Brown versus Board of Education is upheld by the Supreme Court, reversing Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896. And then 1956, the Montgomery boycott occurred. And during that time, in 1950, the income received by the wealthy, by the top 1%, dropped to 17.5%. And by 1956, it was 13.8%. By 1967, when you had the environmental movement and the civil rights movement in full bloom and the women's movement and the war against shoddy and unsafe products produced by corporate America, led by Ralph Nader himself, their share of income had dropped to 12.4% because all of those things cut into corporate profit margins. And then in 1970, you had the wealthy were only receiving 10.4%, or less than 1/3 of what they were receiving in 1929. Well, there was a problem with this. And the problem was simple. In 1929, the Great Depression began, as mentioned earlier. And within the next 4 years, stock prices dropped 90 to 95%. That meant that the primary financial ways of getting cash for the top 1% had plummeted. So that, with that, their political power plummeted. And things like Social Security came through, unemployment insurance, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and other things. However, by 1970, as mentioned, the wealthy, the top 1%, were receiving only 10.4% of the income produced in the United States. And I think they were visualizing the same exact scenario over again. They were not getting anywhere. The stock market since 1967, the Dow Jones Industrial, had fallen for the last 3 years. So they began a counterattack as early as 1967. They'd always been trying to build an oligarchic movement, and they did. And by 1968, they had their president, Richard M. Nixon. But they didn't have the courts. FDR had made certain with that, along with Truman and Eisenhower and Kennedy, by the way. And then Nixon nominated a tobacco attorney to be a Supreme Court justice. And with that, I'll tell you the rest of the story on the next episode. So you guys have a good one. I hope you enjoyed this lecture and my high-tech whiteboard. Anyway, talk to you later. Have a good one.